Let's go! Oh no, Terrace Marshall Jr. is leaving the team, and I'm going to explain why this is actually a good thing. Now, let's be clear. At the time of this recording, it is not official. He hasn't come out and released his own Twitter, Instagram statement just yet, but this is a good thing for all parties involved. So, if you want deep LSU discussion like this, go on ahead and hit the subscribe button. So, Terrace Marshall gone. I am all about it. He deserves this opportunity. Now, a lot of you are going to point out, before the Arkansas game, he gave a speech to the team where he basically said, I could opt out. But here's the thing. He actually backed it up. He went out and played a good game against Arkansas, played even better against Texas A&M, and there's nothing more for him to gain. He's put so much good film out there, and, the only thing is I wish when Jamar opted out, LSU gave Terrace Marshall Jr. the number 7 jersey. He deserves it. He really does. And, there's a huge difference between what Terrace Marshall did and what Jamar Chase did. At least Terrace gave you some games. Now, like I've said plenty of times, Jamar Chase, made the right decision for himself. He's still going to be a top 10 pick. But Terrace Marshall Jr. went out there, put out the good film, and there's nothing more for him to gain. There's just not. I mean, we'll show how statistically Terrace Marshall Jr. is one of the greatest wide receivers ever. But I've always pointed this out. I never want a football player to play this extremely violent game when in the back of their mind they're worried about being injured and or are not 100% wanting to be there. And in this case, Terrace Marshall Jr., like any other human being, is a guy who thinks about injury before his big payday coming up. Remember, Terrace Marshall Jr. in high school missed most of his senior season due to an ankle injury, okay? That's injury number 1. But then, of course, last year, Terrace Marshall Jr., another foot injury, which caused him to miss a chunk of the 2019 season. Even with that injury, guess what? He still scored 13 touchdowns. And there's one thing about those 13 touchdowns we don't talk enough about. That is coming up in just a moment. But, like I said, football is not a game to be played by the meek. And I'm not saying Terrace Marshall Jr. is a scaredy cat or anything like that. I'm just saying when you feel an injury can alter your career, when the games aren't the games that you're playing right now aren't going towards a national championship, which you already won for your team the year before, I don't want him to be there. And you shouldn't want him to be there either. Now, has Terrace Marshall Jr. been the best LSU offensive player this year? Absolutely. And honestly, it's not even close. After Miles Brennan got hurt, guess what? Terrace Marshall Jr. still put up big stats. As you can see here, he has 18 more catches than anyone and doubled the amount of yards than any other receiver on this team. And no other receiver on the team has more than 2 touchdowns outside of Terrace Marshall Jr., where he has 10. So for him to go out there, give it his all each and every week, and by the way, he just saw his teammate, Racey McMath, really hurt his hamstring against Arkansas when Racey McMath just got the coveted Senior Bowl invite. You don't want players playing with that in the back of their mind, especially a player like Terrace Marshall Jr., who had to recover from 2 injuries to become the player that he became at LSU. Once again, this is a really good thing. Now, we don't have a chance against Alabama without Terrace. I know some people are going to say that, but the bottom line is you had no shot against Alabama from the get-go. Now, take a look at these numbers. We just showed them to you. 48 catches, 731 yards, 10 touchdowns. And the funny thing about that is if you go to his game log, as bad as the Texas A&M game was offensively, take a look at this. He balled out yesterday. He had the one explosive play on offense, 10 catches, 134 yards, and the garbage time touchdown at the end. Then you also had this Missouri game, which was ridiculous. 11 catches, 235, 3 touchdowns when the other team knew that they were throwing you the football. And then the South Carolina game with the new quarterback, TJ Finley. Just incredible stuff from him. And this is the added benefit to the whole thing, is that Terrace Marshall Jr. is not going to be taking away targets that are actually intended for players that are going to help build your future program. So, let's be honest. Terrace Marshall Jr. is going to the NFL. No matter if you win or lose the rest of these games, it doesn't matter. The season's lost, okay? So, let's see how Kayshon Boutte, let's see how, and as you can see here, Kayshon Boutte has been getting better and better and better, and it's Boutte. Kayshon Boutte has been getting better and better and better. The Texas A&M stat line doesn't look good, but as many of you know, he was robbed of the touchdown. Coy Moore, another young wide receiver, caught himself 9 passes this year. Jaray Jenkins, who's kind of balled out this year. Look at his numbers. So obviously nothing too spectacular, but let's see how Jaray Jenkins plays in the number 1 role. And then Jontre Kirkland, who's a senior. He could come back next year. Alex Adams, maybe he gets some snaps. And then I keep hearing this from you guys. Well, why doesn't Trey Palmer get some more touches? So, I guess we're not going to get stats on Trey. So, this gives all these other guys some much-needed reps, especially knowing next year you have such a loaded wide receiver class coming in with 4 total receiver commits, 5 if Brian Thomas Jr. decides to come. So this is going to help you provide some clarity for next year, especially when you're playing with 2 younger quarterbacks over the next 2 games. So I think this is good. These guys are going to get some extra reps. Now, it sucks they're going up against Alabama. It sucks that it's Patrick Surtain they're going to be going up against, who's, of course, an incredible corner for Alabama. But still, it's just one of those things. It's not the be-all, end-all. Get some other guys some reps. Now, let's discuss Terrace Marshall's legacy. Where does he fall into the line of the greatest wide receivers ever? Now, of course, he's still going to be behind Justin Jefferson. He's still going to not be Jarvis Landry, or is he Jarvis Landry? Because it's interesting. Obviously, Jamar Chase, greatest wide receiver season by any LSU player last year. But I could argue that Terrace Marshall Jr.'s legacy is better than Chase because he came back and fought his tail off for a team that has been in turmoil. Could you imagine how bad LSU would be now if they didn't have Terrace Marshall Jr.? Missouri would have ran you off the field. So let's go back to his 2019 season where, he did catch 13 touchdowns. And the one thing you'll notice is he actually played his best football after his injury against the better team. So Texas, 6 catches, 123 and a touchdown. Auburn, the big touchdown in the red zone to help win that game. Alabama caught a wide-open touchdown. But then you go up here, and this is where he played his absolute best football when LSU really needed them, especially against Oklahoma and UGA, where they decided to cover Jamar Chase heavily. Look at this. 5 receptions, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns. Most notably, the Joe Burrow. His circus catch from Joe Burrow happened against Oklahoma. 6 catches, 80 yards, 2 touchdowns. And remember, 4 of those touchdowns went to Justin Jefferson. But his biggest game was the Clemson game. And the stat line doesn't look huge. But the touchdown to make it a 17-point game and to put Clemson to night-night was a 50-50 ball. And Joe Burrow trusted Terrace Marshall to make that play, and he did. And earlier in the game, Terrace Marshall Jr. drew a pass interference call on 3rd and 19 to give LSU a first down right before the half. That, of course, was the famous Joe Burrow 29-yard quarterback draw that we did a 30-minute film study on. If it weren't for Terrace Marshall to draw that pass interference call on 3rd and 19, where he burned the safety, bottom line, okay? He is the reason that LSU won all those games last year. Not quite as much as Chase or Burrow or Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Jefferson, but to overcome an injury midway through and come back and hit the ground running, I will never, ever, ever, ever forget him for that. So his legacy should be one of the greatest LSU receivers of all time. And I'm interested to get your thoughts on that. Where does Terrace Marshall rank amongst the greatest LSU wide receivers ever? I think he's in that discussion. I really do. Now, a couple of you, including myself, have floated the idea of Derek Mason joining LSU staff. He was a great defensive coordinator at Stanford, but only for a year back in 2012 and 2013. They fired him after an 0-8 season. They were beat down 41-0. Obviously, a very professional statement here from Coach Mason. So, does LSU bring him on as an analyst or maybe the next defensive coordinator? It's out there now. He's a free agent. So, we've seen Nick Saban do this. Bring head coaches who weren't so good at other stops and put them under their wing, whether it be Lane Kiffin or Steve Sarkisian, and the list goes on. The former Tennessee coach, who was the worst SEC coach before Chad Morris. Butch Davis, isn't that? No, not Butch Davis. God, I can't think of his name. So, a lot of you have sent me this tweet, and this is for a subscriber shout-out. John has sent me this. Cliff has sent me this, and a few others. So instead of subscriber shout-out, I'll just go straight to this tweet and this quote from Ed Orgeron after the game. And we also chatted about it on the live stream. I think we need to call better plays. I think we need to have a better plan. So, yeah, there's some scary things about that quote. Is Ed Orgeron going to start calling some plays? Is he going to dip his toe into the defensive or offensive play calling? Is he going to hand over the play calling duties from one coach to another just to see what happens? I don't know, but, in our film study tomorrow, I'm going to go through some personnel changes that I think LSU should make. Like I always say, I hate criticizing players. I really do, because no matter how you view college football, as much as we love it, it is a transition phase for each and every athlete who plays it, whether it's a transition to their next college if they decide to transfer, whether it's a transition to the NFL or a transition to their professional life outside of football. It's a very weird phase for 18 to 23-year-old kids. And, well, they're adults, but if you're in your 30s, when you were 18 and 23, you weren't the brightest. Maybe you were the dumbest during that phase, like myself. I just don't like to get too critical of players, but on tomorrow's video, I will let you in on some personal changes that I would make. So let's have a discussion in the comment section about this. Should LSU switch up the play callers? I don't know. So subscribe to the channel, guys. Thank you so much. This is a very stripped down version of what we do on this channel. It's Power Hour LSU. Boom! Pork chops tonight. Let's go. Give me a let's go.